The Leica SL2 was introduced to the market more than half a year ago, and since then I did a lot of reviews and tutorials on my channel. I think it's a fantastic camera. And just a few weeks ago the Leica M10-R hit the market, which is the new Leica rangefinder camera, also fantastic. By now I have already 4 videos on my channel dealing with the camera, and there is much more to come in the next weeks and months. In this video I want to do something special. I want to do a full comparison of both cameras and will help you to decide what choice should you make if you want to go for a Leica system camera. Should you go for the rangefinder series M10R or should you go for the system camera SL2? And it will be a bit longer than usual, but it will hopefully provide all the data points you need for your decision. Let's kick off the video. The game plan for this video is as follows. First of all, I will compare the main features of both camera bodies. Second, I want to look into dynamic range and resolution of both camera sensors, and I will do this via a live shooting where the cameras are side by side on a tripod. And third, and last but not least, I will also quickly look into exposures at night and how these sensors perform, and then I will wrap up my findings and will provide some conclusions and of course also some advice for people who watch that video. Last remark before we kick off is, on the Leica M10R I will use the Aposumicron M50mm f2, and on the Leica SL2 I will use the Aposumicron SL 50mm f2, so fully comparable setups. Both are kind of the best lenses you can get for both systems, and that's why I think this is the best choice for that comparison here in this video. The first eye-catching difference when you look at the Leica SL2, here as said before with the Aposumicron SL 50mm, and the Leica M10-R, also with the Aposumicron 50mm, is the viewfinder. And on the Leica SL2, you have a general electronic viewfinder with a super high resolution, and it's an OLED viewfinder, so fantastic quality. And that's what people are used to from DSLMs typically. And on the Leica M10R, you have an optical viewfinder. You can use an electronic viewfinder from Leica and put it into the hot shoe, but that viewfinder is by far no match for the electronic viewfinder of the Leica SL2. And what people typically use here is the optical viewfinder, which is a rangefinder. And I will post a link to a video where I explain in detail how rangefinder focusing works. And I will also provide the section in the video so you can scroll right away to that video and see how this is working. But it is an old school method from photography to find focus, whereas on the electronic viewfinder, of course, you have a usual setup as you know it from other DSLMs. And of course, and that's maybe the most important point, on the Leica SL2 you have autofocus, you have focus tracking, all the features on focusing people like half pressing the shutter button and then getting focus. Here focus is manual, follows via the distance scale on the lenses here in the M series universe, and there is no autofocus available. It's old school focusing, but nice focusing I should say. I love rangefinder cameras and the old way of finding focus, and there are also advantages. Don't be misled and think that you can focus quickly only on an autofocus camera. No, you can do this also here by using the rangefinder features and the distance scale and choosing the aperture in line with the distance scale in a way that everything is immediately in focus. So I post that link down below in the info box, but that's the first eye-catching difference. A very large, very nice, very high resolution OLED electronic viewfinder, autofocus, focus tracking, and all the features you would expect from a modern camera. Here only manual focus, rangefinder style, and all in old school, but for people who enjoy it, just something very, very nice. Next big difference when it comes to the two camera sensors is that on the Leica SL2 we have in-body image stabilization. That's not the case for the rangefinder cameras from Leica, not even for the most modern one, the Leica M10R. And image stabilization is good for a lot of things. First of all, you can probably win up to 5 stops if you have the right lens and if you have the right parameters. Let's quickly switch on the camera for a second so that we can look into that. It also has on the drive mode, if we go into here, it has the multi-shot option. And the multi-shot option basically takes 8 images shifted by half a pixel in various directions and composes it in the camera body into an image of 187 megapixels, and it will be a raw file, so you can go very far in post. It's nice. There is a video on my channel where I look into the feature. It came with firmware 2.0, and I think that's a useful feature. Nothing you need to have, but nice to have. And that's of course not possible with a rangefinder camera like the M10R, because here the sensor is fixed mounted and not floating in a magnetic field. There is no in-body image stabilization for that sensor. So you need to stick to the good old rules of photography when you take your exposure time. The next big difference is video capabilities. Leica skipped the video functionality on their new rangefinder camera series, and the Leica M10R, like the M10P, has no video functionality. On older M series rangefinders you have at least 1080p video capability, but that is, I think, no longer the standard. You should have 4K if you're a video shooter. On the SL2 you have all that, so it's very simple to switch here into video mode. Just swipe and then your menu here in the status screen turns white in the background color, and if you go into the menu here you have all kinds of features. Most importantly, on the video format resolution you can choose between MOV and MP4, and on MOV you even can shoot up to 5K, which is very nice, but you also have cinematic 4K, 4K and all of that. So you have autofocus, you have focus tracking, you can use all kinds of features videographers love. And if you want to have video features in the same camera what you take for pure photography, then the Leica SL2 is an excellent choice, and you would be completely lost with a rangefinder here. Let's switch the camera on for a moment. The only video feature you can do here is time lapses. So if you go into drive mode, you have a fully fledged intervalometer, which you also have on the Leica SL2. And that intervalometer can be used if you set the parameters to shoot a lot of still frames and then compile them later in post-processing into 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. And you can do time-lapse videos, but that's all. There is no video capability on the new rangefinder series from Leica. Let's quickly go into the drive mode on both cameras, because I think that's very simple then to get it in one view here. So let's put this away. Let's go into drive mode. And then you have, it's very hard for me to show. Let's see, you have single shooting, you have continuous shooting here, low speed, you have continuous medium high speed, very high speed, and that's all based on autofocus features, of course. Self-timer is the same on both cameras. Interval shooting, as I said before, is an intervalometer which is fully fledged, built in on both cameras. So you can do nice, let's say 8K time lapses via composition of single frames in post. You have here exposure bracketing. Let's look into that. You have exposure bracketing here too. So this is here, exposure bracketing. You have the self-timer in the same way as I said and showed before. You have the intervalometer. And the continuous and low speed and high speed shooting here is based on your rangefinder settings and has nothing to do with autofocus. Whereas here you have focus tracking when you go into continuous shooting. So let's go up here. This is all based on autofocus. Of course, you can also do this in manual focusing mode. You can do everything manual, even the focus with the Leica SL2, and then it will stick to the focus you've pre-chosen, but it is also based on fully fledged autofocus tracking. And of course, depending on low, medium, high or very high speed, you have more frames per second, we can be shut. And in general, also here, the Leica SL2 is very likely to be called the more modern camera with top-notch qualities of a top-notch full-frame DSLM. That's not the case for the rangefinder cameras. A lot of features are missing here, and if you're going for the most feature-packed camera, then the Leica SL2 is a much better choice because it just has more things built in. Exposure bracketing we covered, that's in both cameras. If you want to go for HDR, for instance, you can do several frames via exposure bracketing in both camera bodies, but you have to composite them yourself on your computer in Lightroom, for instance. And there is a video on my channel where I show how this works and where you can actually deal with difficult light situations. Both cameras have remote controlling capabilities, and that's even true for the rangefinder here. So if I go to the menu and go into the different settings here, I have the Leica Photos app section here, and then I can remotely control the camera via iOS or some other, let's say, mobile device. And the same applies, of course, to the Leica SL2. So if I go into the menu here and I can scroll, oh, here it was actually here already. And then with the Leica Photos app, I can remotely control the camera and do remote shootings from a distance, which is nice. And that's included on both cameras. In general, as I said before, the Leica SL2 is much more feature packed, has much richer menus and items, and is also more customizable via these different buttons here along the camera body than what you get on the Leica M10R. To some extent, this is more about pure photography, no videography, and is to focus on photography only. This one here is a technical beast to some extent, and there would be much more things to say if we quickly go into the menu here, but I'll keep this short because I don't want to overload the video. So I think here we covered everything, but shutter type is something you can change on the SL2. You have only mechanical shutter on the Rangefinder series cameras from Leica, so there is no electronic shutter here. Here you could go for electronic, which is very useful for time lapses. For instance, for time lapses with the SL2, I always go for electronic shutter here because it's not using the mechanical shutter and wasting the number of shots possible mechanically with the shutter, which is good. And on the main menu, let's quickly go into that. Photos app, I think we covered. Let's start from scratch here. You have here also the option, which is very nice, included to actually switch long exposure noise reduction off. You cannot do this on the Leica M10 series cameras. It will automatically use exposure noise reduction if you take long exposures. On the Leica SL2, you can decide yourself if you want to have it, which is nice for astrophotography if you do not want the camera to calculate away certain stars. Shutter, I think I covered already. You can go to a crop format on the sensor, so you can crop down. Both cameras have a full frame sensor, 36 × 24 millimeters, but here you can also crop down to APS-C format, which saves you some pixels and some file size, of course. And you also have 2 SD card slots here in the SL2, which you don't have here. You have just one SD card here. So if I open this up here, I have 2 slots, which is good for backup, additional storage, and just to be on the safe side and not losing images. So let's quickly open up the M10R now to see what's in there. On the Leica M10R, you don't have that. You have here basically just one SD card in the slot, and you don't have a spare SD card for additional storage capability or as a backup, which is something to bear in mind if you're a professional shooter, of course, and you're shooting a wedding, for instance. Here you can make sure you always have a backup of your file on the second SD card, which saves operational risk, of course. If one SD card might break, the second one will have the images, and so on and so on. I think there is a lot to say. There are lots of differences between these cameras, and I think it's time now to look into image quality of these sensors. And to start right away, this camera here has 47 megapixels in the RAW format and in the JPEG, and this one here has 40 megapixels. This sensor is very likely developed in alignment with the new sensor in the Leica M10 monochrome. And so we have 7 megapixels of difference, but my gut feeling tells me the difference will not be eye-catching. So let's have a look into resolution, into dynamic range, and let's look into image quality in general. The live shooting will take place in my current location, so I'm here halfway on holidays in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland called Ticino at Lake Lugano, but I also have some tasks to do in corporate photography, and it's unfortunately difficult weather. I will come back to this in a moment, but nevertheless I will do my best, and I will use the opportunity to put both cameras side by side and will guide you through the testing process, and then we look into the images in post. So sorry for the background noise. First of all, I'm on the balcony of my hotel. I also have to be a bit more silent with my voice than usual. And of course there are other people who try to find rest and peace here and have their summer holidays. So we are shooting over Lake Lugano to the other side of the lake. You see here the green field indicating when the autofocus is sitting. You also see the red color from the focus peaking. And if we quickly go into the status menu, I have a 12-second self-timer here. I have single autofocus and a field autofocus. On metering, I have multi-field or matrix metering, which I think is the right for these lighting conditions. And of course, I'm going for the large JPEG for a glimpse preview and the digital negative. So I think that's just right and everything we need to know from the status screen. On shooting mode, I'm on fully manual. I have an ISO of 100, which is what I also will choose on the Leica M10R. I'm going for an aperture of f5.6 because for testing, that's for many lenses the sweet spot. Not too wide open, not too much closed, and will not go for a match of the shutter speeds of the two cameras. We'll just trust the built-in light meter of the camera to create the correct exposure. So for instance, if I turn the wheel here on top of the camera, you see these little dashes to the left-hand side, which is aligned with faster shutter speeds, and then the image becomes underexposed. I can underexpose here up to 3 stops. And let's go back. And then if I turn it in the other direction, I do an overexposure here, and clearly I get a slower shutter speed than here. And we'll trust the light meter of the camera and make sure that we always keep this balanced in the way that the light meter of the camera is telling me this is the correct exposure. And that's the way we make these images comparable. We will take 3 images, one with the correct exposure, one stop down by 2 stops, and one basically overexposed with 2 stops, and then we'll compare them in post between both cameras. So let's go for the first shot. This is, camera is telling me 1/300 seconds is the right exposure time or shutter speed here. While the counter is counting down, let me use the opportunity to say that we have very hazy weather conditions here. So the mountains in the background far behind the city are very foggy. That typically happens in Switzerland based on the lakes and if you have humid and hot weather in summer. All right, now let's underexpose by 2 stops. I think that's it. You see how the shutter speed is then chosen much faster, of course. Again, we use the counter to make sure we have a sturdy shooting situation here. And then we have another shot to do, which is overexposing up to 2 stops. I think that's it. 1/60 seconds now. And let's see what we can recover in the overexposed parts of the image and in the highlights. When the shot is done, we'll turn our attention to the Leica M10R and do exactly the same exercise. Let's just, for the sake of completeness, get this back into balanced exposure here. All right. So same exercise now for the Leica M10R. I will accelerate this now. I'm in manual shooting mode, ISO is 100. We have here 1/500 seconds for the correct exposure. So this is overexposed, underexposed, but you don't see it. You have to half press the shutter button to actually see overexposure and underexposure on the Leica M10R. This is not an immediate preview as we have it on the Leica SL2. Of course I can change that. So when I say that I have permanent exposure preview on the Leica SL2 and on the M10R I need to half press down the shutter button here or the release, then this is a setting question. And just as a quick excursion how you can change that, I go into the menu and then on the menu I go into Capture Assistance, and on Capture Assistance there is Exposure Simulation, and this is now release half pressed. That's my setting because I want to spare battery power, but you can change that by just switching into permanent, and then the exposure preview will be permanent in the same way as it is on the Leica SL2, just as a quick side remark here. And we have the 50mm upper summicron, as said before, and the aperture is at f5.6. As mentioned in various videos, Leica M series cameras do not have electronic contacts between the lens and the body, so it's guessing based on exposure what the correct aperture is. So in metadata this will not appear very likely as f5.6. Let's take the shot. We have a 12-second self counter here, timer. Let's quickly check the image. Oh yes, this is very sharp. Looks excellent. Very, very good. Very happy with what I'm seeing here. So now let's overexpose by 2 stops. So this is here. Yeah, looks kind of the same as what we saw on the Leica SL2. So and now we underexpose by 2 stops. This is here. It goes to 1/2000 seconds here. And the preview becomes very dark. and now we can go into post and compare these images. So I'm now in Capture 120. I have the two images in front of me. On the left hand side is the Leica M10R, and on the right hand side is the Leica SL2. And these are the correct exposures, in the way that correct means that the light meter of the camera body was suggesting this is correctly exposed now. And if we look quickly into the metadata, on the Leica M10R we have 7864 times 5200 as resolution, and on the Leica SL2, if I switch to the right hand side image, we have that bit of more resolution, which distinguishes 40 megapixel on the M10R from 47 megapixel on the Leica SL2. And it's not that much, and you see it easily when you go and simultaneously we are pressing and holding the shift key on the Leica M10R go to 100%. Then on the Leica M10R we get this here, and on the Leica SL2, if I just match the same image crop here, we are up to 94%. So on the left hand side, M10R 100% corresponds to 94% on the Leica SL2 side on the right hand side. And that's not that much of a difference. So I would actually say that the resolution of the sensor is pretty much comparable. I don't think that in daily life you really notice the difference between 40 megapixels and 47 megapixels. And if we go back for a moment, or maybe we just stick to the metadata here and scroll down on the M10R. So we have an ISO of 100. We have the same on the Leica SL2. And the M10R was suggesting, in terms of the light meter built into the camera, of 1/500 seconds, whereas the Leica SL2 was going for 1/320 seconds, and is also correctly showing the aperture here of f5.6, whereas on the Leica M10R, as mentioned before, it's the best guess of the camera body because it cannot transport information what aperture has been chosen on the lens into the camera body. So it's saying here an aperture of f3.4, but clearly the shot was taken at f5.6. So that's basically what we have. If we would go up on the Leica SL2 side, on the right hand side image, to 100% too, you see the difference is hardly noticeable. So if your decision is up to getting the best in terms of resolution, it's not a criteria I would take into account, because the 47 megapixels compared to the 40 megapixels is a negligible difference between the two cameras. Now, if we would go into a 200% crop, let's again select the Leica M10R image. Let's move the slider here on Capture 1 to 200%. Then you see here, this is still absolutely comparable. And I think in terms of resolution, these images are very much the same. So resolution and, let's say, sensor pixels is absolutely no criteria I would follow up here. Having said that, and in addition, maybe as an argument, already at 24 megapixels, these Leica M series rangefinder cameras have what I call deep pixels. It means that the resolution and the sharpness of the images always looks very good, even if you go for large prints. So I never had difficulties doing large prints if the image comes from a Leica M series rangefinder camera. You get a lot of detail here in these images if we go along the waterfront on the other side of the lake here. Very nice. If we go to the more hazy parts of the image, I think also here these images are very much comparable. As I mentioned in the live shooting, the weather conditions are very difficult here because we have that humidity in the air, but it looks all very nice. Even if you look at these little houses here, is absolutely the same. And we are now here at a 200% crop, which means on both cameras you can go for very large prints. You will have all the reserves for cropping into the image, and there is absolutely nothing to complain. Maybe let's cross the lake for a moment. So here are the trees. If we look into that, even here you see a lot of detail in both cameras. Here on the right hand side we had that little boat in the shot. Here, if you look at the boat here and here, is very much the same. So I think the Leica M10R 40 megapixel sensor is an excellent match for the 47 megapixel sensor of the Leica SL2. So these are now the two images which are underexposed by two stops. So on the left hand side again the M10R, on the right hand side the Leica SL2. Again, the exposure time or shutter speed was chosen differently by the light meter in the two cameras, but the images look pretty much the same. Now if I go to the exposure slider here and increase the M10R by two stops, this looks as follows. And on the SL2 let's do the same. And I think now these images are exactly like what we saw before on the correctly exposed images. And if we zoom in, let's just go to 100% here. There is the same level of clarity, sharpness, and there is absolutely nothing where I would say we should complain. This looks all pretty nice, and so you can easily underexpose by 2 or 3 stops and recover everything out of the shadows. I think that's just working perfectly on both cameras. In these images, I see no difference at all, besides the tiny little difference in resolution. As you saw before, 100% on the Leica M10R corresponds to 94% on the Leica SL2, based on the higher resolution of 47 megapixels compared to 40 megapixels. Maybe one last thing before we progress in the video is we have, if we go back to the underexposure here, so let's go back to the previous images as they came out of the camera. They are actually all unedited besides what you've seen here when I increased exposure. But if we look at the left-hand side, lower or bottom parts of the images, we have these dark parts here coming from the trees. And we can, of course, also recover them by increasing and boosting up the shadows. Let's do this for a moment. Let's again go back to a correction on the exposure side on both cameras. Let's boost up the shadows here, and let's go 2 stops up here. And then if we look into the image, 100%, and we look into the trees, and I think there is absolutely nothing to complain. So I boosted up the shadows to 100% up, and I corrected the exposure by 2 stops up on both images. And actually here this looks very, very nice. Now this is always the more interesting part of the exercise, coming from blown out highlights and trying to recover in post. Left hand side again the M10R, right hand side the SL2. And the math does not work in terms of shutter speed here. And you saw that I intentionally have chosen in the live demonstration of the shooting to go -2 stops and +2 stops based on the built-in light meter of the cameras, and not by doing the math on exposure time. And if you look, for instance, on the Leica SL2 into the metadata, if you remember on the correctly exposed image, correctly exposed according to the light meter in the camera, we were at a shutter speed of 1/320 seconds. Now 320 divided by 2 is 160, and 160 divided by 2 is 80, of course. So we should have here 1/80 seconds. The camera has chosen to go to 1/60 seconds, so is slightly slower. And on the M10R, it's kind of the same situation. We came from 1/500. 500 divided by 2 is 250. Divided by 2 is 125, but we are slower here at 190 seconds and not 1/25 seconds. But nevertheless, the images look blown out in the same way. I think the M10R looks a little less blown out on this part of the mountains here. And let's now go to a recovery via the exposure slider. So on the M10R, we go down by 2 stops on the exposure slider. Let's do the same on the SL2. And immediately you see that the recovery of the structure of the clouds, let's maybe zoom in a little bit. Let's go to 67%. So if you look at the clouds here on the M10R and on the Leica SL2, the recovery of the structure of the clouds is much better on the Leica M10R. And that's something I need to explore a little deeper in the next weeks, if this is a general phenomenon or if there is a mistake underlying or if there is something else going on here. But it seems that if we just correct for 2 stops up on the light meter of the 2 cameras and then correct exactly 2 stops in post, that the recovery on overblown highlights is stronger and better on the Leica M10R than on the Leica SL2. Let's go to 100% for a moment. Let's go down again to the lake and the waterfront here. And here it's pretty much comparable. So I don't see any noticeable difference here. It's sharp, it's crisp. Let's look at the trees. You see that little house here at the bottom of the image. Here again on the trees and the branches of the trees. Very crisp, very nice, very sharp, all recovered nicely from the previous situation where you basically saw a super overexposed image. But on the clouds, there is a noticeable difference here. And I think that's remarkable, at least something to put pro memoriam on a list and explore any further. If you have any experiences and by chance have both cameras or can play with both cameras, why don't you drop me a comment what you think, and if this is something you would confirm or reject based on your own experience. So we are coming to the end of the video and I will wrap up in a moment, but one last topic I wanted to cover is exposures at night, because that's very important for me. I'm a nighttime shooter. I love it to be out there with my camera at nighttime and taking long exposures. So this was a shot taken with the M10R, and it's a 32-second exposure at an aperture of f4 at an ISO of 100, again with the aposumicron M, with widest open aperture of f2 and 50mm focal length. And this image here became incredibly hard to obtain because of the hazy weather conditions. Because if the weather is hazy, it's even more difficult to take clean exposures at night. And of course, stars were not really visible in that scene based on the weather conditions. So I could go for 32 seconds or maybe even longer if I wanted. I remember that I played a lot at that night and gained experience how the M10R is dealing with long exposures at night, which I did at different shootings before, and there are already, I think, some hints and videos on my channel where you can look this up. Now on the left-hand side, you see the image as it came out of the camera as a digital negative. It's the raw file. And on the right-hand side, you see it after post-processing. And if we zoom into that image, first of all, on the dark parts here, you see how nicely I could recover the tree structure and colors out of the shadows here on that very dark image on the left-hand side, which was the original out of the camera. If we look further into the image, it's very sharp, very crisp. If you look at the waterfront, again here, recovery out of highlights. So I was reducing the highlights in post-processing. A very nice, clean, crisp image. And even if you look at the mountains here, so you see the level of noise was easy to be controlled by the noise reduction or luminance slider. And in general, a very good result for a hazy night as we had it at that particular evening here. To turn our attention to the other camera, the SL2 at night, here a comparable image, left-hand side, before post-processing, camera raw as it came out of the camera, right-hand side, post-processed, kind of the same settings. So I copy-pasted the settings in Lightroom from the M10R image to the SL2 image, with one exception. I increased the exposure a little more on the exposure slider to 1.5. Again, a very nice result. If you look into that, for instance, on the tree side, completely dark as it came out of the camera, super recovered on the right-hand side after post-processing. The buildings here and the images look very nice, recovering out of the highlights on the buildings and the lights here. Super sharp, super crisp. And also on the noise, again, very nicely controllable via luminance slider. And you see here tiny little star dashes coming from a 24-second exposure at this time. So on the metadata, I was going here for 24 seconds at aperture of f5.6, again at an ISO 100, which is on both cameras, the Leica SL2 and the Leica M10R, the native ISO as it is adjusted on the calibration of the camera sensor. So very nice result on both cameras. I would say the Leica SL2, because I have a lot of experience with that camera already, is a fantastic camera for night photography, stars, night sky, Milky Way, what have you. And I think the Leica M10R looks equally promising at this part of the photography story you can create with both cameras here. So let's quickly wrap up the video and conclude. So I mentioned in the first part of the video a lot of differences, minor differences and major differences of the Leica SL2 compared to the M10R, but it all boils down to the following. For videographers, the Leica SL2 delivers an all-in package for still images as well as videos up to 5K or 4K or cinematic 4K, which is not included in the Leica M10R. The Leica M10R, in contrast, is a pure photography device, whereas the Leica SL2 is feature-packed in the way I described in the first part of the video. When it comes to image or more general sensor quality, both cameras are a perfect match to each other, and 40 megapixels versus 47 megapixels really don't make a big difference, as I demonstrated on the images coming out of the live shooting. Resolution is not a criteria here. You should actually take into account when you have to make a decision between the two cameras. On dynamic range, I think both cameras recovered nicely structure and color out of shadows and also out of highlights. It seemed that recovery out of highlights was better when it came to structure on the clouds, as you saw before, on the Leica M10R than I was able to get it out of the Leica SL2. And that's something where I have to follow up. It's something to explore in more detail. And I will very likely post another video just focusing on that particular aspect of the camera comparison. Now, last but not least, there are two more things to mention. First of all, the Leica M10R, as I said, as a pure photography instrument, is a much smaller camera body, and the lenses are much smaller and also have in general less weight. And that is a special feature of the Leica camera and lens lineup, that the cameras and the lenses on the M series rangefinder cameras are smaller and lighter than what you typically have in other camera systems. And the Leica SL2 is more the usual DSLM beast with larger lenses, sometimes heavy lenses, and a larger camera body based on the feature-packed properties the camera offers to the user. And of course, the rangefinder series cameras are a bit more pricey or expensive than what you have to pay for a body of the Leica SL2. And the same applies also to some of the lenses. There are very expensive lenses in the Leica M series universe, like for instance the Summilux 90mm f1.5 or the very famous Noctilux lenses. And on the Leica SL2, lenses are more expensive than what you typically pay for other camera brands, but they are a little less pricey and less expensive than what you have on the rangefinder series lineup. So which camera is for you now? If you are the one who is a pure photographer, loves taking perfect quality images and focusing on photography art, the Leica M10R is, I think, the best choice people can make. It's small, compact, lightweight. It is expensive and pricey, but it offers the best you can get with a super high resolution now based on the new Leica M10R sensor. If you are a flexible person who wants to have videography and photography feature-packed technology, then the Leica SL2 is the better choice. It's also a bit less expensive, but you have to pay in terms of weight and size. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me your thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching and peace out.